Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I've been given this opportunity to give a presentation, cross-workshop, cross-lecture on a very important topic which some of us may have considered and acted upon, and some of us perhaps may not have. It's definitely something that every Muslim in the UK particularly needs to, at some point, sooner rather than later, consider and implement before the inevitable happens. Everyone is destined to die. That is, perhaps the single truth that everybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, believes will happen. So, and as Muslims, we know we should prepare for this day, and this is one of those things which we should perform and make sure is ready before the inevitable strikes. So the title is Creating a Basic Islamic Will / Wasiyah in the UK. I'm Nabeil Maflahi, and as I mentioned in this disclaimer, I'm not a solicitor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a scholar. I know enough about this topic to be able to advise many people about it, although I will tell you where my knowledge ends and where you should seek professional advice, whether that's from a solicitor or fiqhi advice from a scholar. And definitely there are very complicated cases out there for which you do need to seek advice. But really, for perhaps most people, what we will learn today, inshallah, will suffice, inshallah. First thing about terminology, Arabic terminology. Is it wasiyah or is it wiratha? What's the difference? What are these things? We know that in Islam, when somebody passes away, their wealth gets distributed amongst certain prescribed heirs, particular people in the family, which get, either a fixed share or a part of whatever's left over after particular people have had their prescribed, whether it's a fifth, a sixth, or quarter, whatever. These laws, which determine how much each of these heirs get, this is known as wiratha or irth. And it's a large branch of fiqh. And some people have studied this. Some of you may have studied this, but it is, you'll find it in the books of fiqh. And it's not straightforward, let's just say. I mean, it can get very complicated. A lot of families will have very simple cases, but it can get rather complicated, which is why, one should not just make it up or think they know it and distribute according to their knowledge, but it needs to be grounded in fiqh. This is fard. This is not a joke. It's not something you can play around with. This is something very serious. And in a Muslim country, most of the time you wouldn't have to worry about the rules of wiratha being applied, because it's in the law that the wealth of an individual, the properties of an individual get distributed according to these rules of wiratha. So you don't need a will in a Muslim country to say that I want my wealth to be distributed according to the rules of wiratha, the sharia. Okay, I mean, in a Muslim country, I'm not saying all Muslim countries, But I know in Yemen, for example, Pakistan, no doubt, many other countries, you wouldn't have to worry about that. So there are certain people who get a prescribed share. Okay, they are warithun. Like I said, there's lots of books of fiqh which describe this. There's also verses of prose or poetry been written to summarize these laws and describing who are the people who get a proportion of the wealth, fardan, obligatory, how much they get, and you know, subhanAllah, scholars have spent a lot of time on this. That doesn't mean that you cannot give part of your wealth after death to somebody else. Perhaps you want to give something to somebody from your family even who wouldn't get anything under the rules of wiratha. Say someone more distant. Your grandchildren perhaps, because if you've got children, if you've got sons, for example, then grandchildren won't get anything. Or brothers or sisters perhaps won't get anything because you've got children. But if you want them to get something, or someone even more distant, or someone who is not even related to you, a friend, a colleague, or anybody else, or you would like to give part of your wealth to a charity, and that's what a lot of people do, alhamdulillah, then you can do so. You can stipulate this. This is not wiratha. This is part of a wasiyah. You know, in the Qur'an, min ba'di wasiyyatin yusi biha aw dayn. So you can choose to give somebody else something who wouldn't get anything under the rules of wiratha, but that has to be stipulated in what's known as a wasiyah. And Islamically, this requires a written document with two male witnesses usually. And something else, we'll talk more about it later, but something else that you'll also mention in your wasiyah is debts. Very, very important, particularly if they haven't been written down elsewhere. All right, you should write them in your wasiyah. It becomes obligatory to write them in your wasiyah if they have not been written down previously somewhere else. And like I said, even if they have been written down somewhere else in a document, then it makes good sense to also include that in your wasiyah, just in case. Okay. And hadith, famous hadith, no doubt many of you know this, that it is a duty of a Muslim, and this is in Sahih Bukhari, who has anything to bequeath. So if you'd like to give something away in a wasiyah, then really you should not let 2 nights pass without you writing it down. You can't just be thinking about it. I've got this wealth and I want to give it away to so-and-so, or to charity or whatever, and just have it in your mind. No, you need to formalize this and write it down and have witnesses. Must I make an Islamic will? Is it fard, recommended, or what? Well, let's just have a look at the 2 basic cases. It can be wajib, it can be obligatory for you to make an Islamic will. When does it actually become obligatory for you to write down a document to say what you want to happen to your wealth upon your death? Well, if you have debts, as we mentioned, okay, debts that have not been written down, you must make a mention of this in your will. And we'll see later on in an example, in a template that we're going to be looking at, where you can write this down in your will. So if you haven't had your debts witnessed and written down previously, you must write them down in your wasiyah. Okay, this is no light matter. It's very, very important. Or you've been entrusted, this is the reverse, you've been entrusted with the wealth of others. Someone has said, look, Akhi, can you please look after this wealth for me? You need to really mention in your wasiyah, in your Islamic will, that this wealth, if it's in my bank account, if it's stored away somewhere, this is not my wealth. This belongs to so and so. All sorts could happen after death. It could be forgotten about. You might not have told your family members or whatever. You must write it down, okay? Because this is the right of the person who entrusted it with you, and it must not be confused with your own wealth and distributed amongst your heirs. And all sorts can happen. SubhanAllah, deaths, SubhanAllah, you hear all sorts of stories where, people, when they think that they can grab hold of somebody's wealth, then they'll ignore any other rights of others. Also, you should mention in your Islamic will is if people owe you money. So you loaned out a piece of property, land, money, gold, whatever, to somebody else. They haven't paid it back to you while you were alive. Well, this needs to be written down somewhere, because this is the right of your heirs. Okay, of course, usually you'd expect the person who borrowed this money or wealth to come and say, look, to the heirs, this is so-and-so's, or I still owe you so much amount of money, but it's not ready, or whatever. It's best to write it down. Okay, so these things you must make sure you mention in your will. Any debts that you owe others, anything that's been entrusted with you, that's owned by other people, or wealth that you are owed by other people, these things you should mention in your Islamic will. You must. It's a sunnah to write an Islamic will if you are wealthy enough and you want to distribute part of your wealth to other people who are not part of your prescribed heirs. Okay, so these, it's not fard, you don't have to, okay, but if you are intending on giving part of your wealth to somebody else, then write it down in an Islamic will. And it could be to a charity that you'd like part of your wealth to be distributed to a charitable cause, then it's a sunnah for you to write this down. As a Muslim, us, alhamdulillah, in the UK, in England, make no doubt about it. There's no doubt. You must write an Islamic will. You must write a will. There is no clause in English law which says that if you are a Muslim, then your wealth will be distributed according to the rules of wiratha. It doesn't exist, of course. Okay? And like I said, shaitan gets the better of some people, unfortunately, and they just think, I'm in the UK, I'll just use British English law or whatever to get what I can. It's haram, but it happens, and I'm sure many of us can relate stories to that effect. So in the UK, in England, write a will. You have to have it, don't delay it. The longer you delay it, the more you're kind of playing around. It's like the shaitan again plays with us, well, you've got plenty of time. We, procrastinate, and lo and behold, subhanAllah, something happens. You might become incapacitated. You might just die suddenly. So you must write a will as soon as you possibly can. If you do not write a will, then unfortunately what happens to your wealth is that it gets distributed according to English law, English intestacy laws, not Islamic laws. And we have a look at an example here. So you pass away. If you have a legally valid Islamic will, then alhamdulillah, your assets would get distributed by the executor. according to Islamic law, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. If you do not have a legally valid Islamic will, then here's an example of what might happen. So one of the spouses passes away, the husband or the wife, she or he gets to keep all of your assets, including property, up to the value of £270,000. There's more, but in a short while. And all your personal possessions, whatever their value. If you have more than £270,000, then the rest of it is split into two halves. Half of it goes to the spouse. They're already getting £270,000 and all your personal possessions. They'll get half of whatever's beyond £270,000. The other half is then split equally amongst the children once they reach adulthood, age of 18 actually. And of course, if you were to accept it as a spouse, as a child, now this is haram to do so, but legally in the UK, what could you do about it? Nothing. If you have no heirs at all, so you are unmarried, no living relatives, the law says in the UK, or English law I should say, that your assets go to the crown, literally, not the king himself, but to the government. It would, in the past, it was the king or the queen in days of old when the crown was in charge. But your assets, all your assets, will just go to the government. You don't want that to happen, of course. Astaghfirullah al-Azim. So that's just an example of intestacy laws being applied. There are more complicated cases, of course. How can you make an Islamic will? Who makes it? How do you go about doing it? Well, it does depend on your circumstances, really. But I think for most people, you should be able to write your own will. Do it yourself. And there's a misconception, really, that you need to get lawyers involved or a solicitor. You need to go to an office and get them involved, writing a document. They have to stamp it, witness it, and so on. This is not necessarily the case. You can do your own research. You can go to the government websites, and they'll tell you precisely how you can write a will. And I've taken a lot of this from the government websites. So when would a do-it-yourself will be suitable? Well, hopefully for most cases, I suspect, if you have assets less than £325,000, this is known as the nil band rate. That's what it is at the moment. I checked, I think, a week ago, and it's still that amount. There is talk, I heard recently, that they might change this and maybe even do without inheritance law entirely. That's definitely what the Tories would want, seeing that they're wealthy, very wealthy, or more wealthy than most people. But if you've got assets, total assets less than this threshold of £325,000, then really you should be writing your own will. There's nothing, waste of money to go to a solicitor and get them to do anything about it. What do I mean by this being the nil band rate? Well, generally speaking, anything above this amount, this nil band that you have, will be taxed by the government at this rate of 40%. So if you have an extra £100,000 on top of that, you have a total of £425,000, then that £325,000, you can distribute as you want, but the £100,000 The government gets to keep 40%, £40,000 of it, and then the £60,000 you can then distribute as you want. If you're married, then assets passed to your spouse will never be susceptible to inheritance law. So if, and it's not Islamic of course, if you were to say, I want all my wealth to go to my spouse, then according to English law, none of it gets taxed upon your death. It'll all get passed to your spouse untaxed. Of course, that's not Islamic law, that all your wealth gets passed to your spouse. There are other heirs involved. When would you need to go to professional will writers or solicitors? Well, generally speaking, if you've got assets more than a couple of £1 million, you should really go to a solicitor. And even if you have wealth above £325,000, it still makes sense, I think, to get professional will writers involved. Now, I've mentioned this here because there's an organization called Islamic Finance Guru, IFG, and others, of course. You can go to Islamic will writers, I Will solicitors, for example. I'm sure you've heard their adverts on Unity FM. You can get them to write your will. And what do they charge? Well, IFG typically charges £98 for their standard will. If you have assets less than £325,000. But like I said, I think that's a waste of money. You can just write it yourself, easily. It doesn't take long to write a will on their website. Even if you have assets more than £325,000, but less than £2 million, they advise that you get solicitors to write a tax-efficient will, one that involves a trust. So your wealth gets put into a trust, and then the executor will distribute that accordingly. And they charge £348. Now, why I mention this is because if you fall into that where you have wealth between £325,000 and £2 million, they do actually, I did check this link recently through Islamic Relief, and they will actually offer this for free. Let me just check if it's still working actually while I'm here. So this is Islamic Relief's website, and they're still offering a free Islamic will service. And like I said, it's through IFG, Islamic Finance Guru. And they explain, to whom is this suitable, and so on. And they will offer that. They will offer that for free. I think they've got Q&A somewhere here. And like they say, thanks to our partnership with IFG, we will provide you with a trust-based will for free. But like I said, even they advise if you have an estate or total asset worth of more than £2 million, then they say, look, we don't want to get involved. Please get a specialist solicitor, tax specialist involved. So don't pay £348 if you fall into that category. Click on that link. These links are all in the handouts that I've given you, inshallah. And I'm sure Abu Bakr will send out the this on the group, so you can. I have put QR codes that you can scan with your phone on those handouts as well. Okay, let's go back. Did that show the Islamic? Yeah, it did. Alhamdulillah, just double checking. So, like I said, If you've, wealth less than £325,000, definitely do your own. Anything up to £2 million, you can potentially still write it yourself, but I would get, these guys involved maybe. Anything beyond that, it's probably best to see a solicitor. Okay. How can you create your own will? Your own Islamic will valid in the UK. According to the website, UK government website, for your homemade will to be legally valid, you must be 18, you must make it voluntarily, you must be of sound mind. Some of this looks like it's come out some of the fiqh books, aqil, baligh, that sort of thing. You must make it in writing. It's not sufficient for you to just say it in front of people and they heard you make the will. It must be done in writing, and it must be signed in the presence of 2 witnesses above the age of 18. So they must see you sign it. It's not a case of you signing your will, showing it them afterwards, and then they sign it. No, they must see you sign it, for obvious reasons. So once you've signed the will in front of the 2 witnesses, they then sign it in front of you. They did kind of change this slightly during COVID, when they didn't allow us to meet people, and then people were like, I need to write my will, but I can't meet people and they can't see me and so on. So they did allow witnessing through video conferencing. Your witnesses see you sign it, and that was, and I think that's still the case. They might remove that clause though soon, from what I heard. In your will, you must make it clear that you are the author of the will, you wrote the will, and that it cancels or revokes any previous wills. Because you may write multiple versions of your will. You need to say that this revokes any previous wills, and therefore it makes sense to therefore date your wills. Okay, otherwise someone will come up with a document and say, oh, there's one here as well. Which one's the latest one? So date your wills as well. What should you include in your Islamic will, your UK valid Islamic will? Like I said, mention any debts. Very, very important. Of course, if you have no debts, then there's nothing to mention here at all. The template that we will see later on will have all these bits and pieces. Anything that doesn't apply, you can just delete. So, you mention this before you start saying what you want to do with your wealth. Clear out the debts. Mention the debts first of all. Any loans that you owe to relatives, friends, banks. It's not just people. If you owe, companies wealth, that's still a debt on your head. And this is very serious in Islam. No doubt we've heard many ahadith which talk about the seriousness of the issue of debt. Even if you're a martyr in Islam, debts aren't forgiven. Hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Nafsul mu'mini mu'allaqatun bidaynihi hatta yuqda anhu." So, your soul remains suspended according to this debt until it's settled or paid off on his behalf. So it's a very serious issue. Nobody wants to die with a debt, literally suspending their soul. What other debts? Things like even zakah that you still haven't paid, that's a debt. Okay, so let's just say I'm not talking about next year's zakah, I'm talking about the zakah that you should have paid but you haven't paid. Obviously, if you pass away and then your year's cycle hasn't finished, then that's not zakah because the whole year hasn't ended while you've still been alive. But zakah that you know that you should have paid, that you haven't paid, mention it in your will. Any mahr that you owe your wife, that's a debt. And that needs to be mentioned if you haven't paid it. Any fidya or kafara, these expiations that, perhaps you might not have paid. An obligatory hajj that you haven't performed. So, if you are able, financially, physically, and so on, to perform hajj, and you just haven't got around to doing it yet, then this is a debt. This must be mentioned, and this must be performed before wealth gets distributed. This is a debt to Allah Azza wa Jal. And we're not talking about a hajj that was, let's just say you haven't performed hajj at all, but you just haven't had the means to perform hajj. You haven't had the wealth or the health, whatever. Then that's not an obligatory hajj, and it doesn't have to be performed. That's not a debt. But I'm talking about a hajj that you should have done because you had the means. And that needs to be stated in your will. Very, very important, because that has to be cleared before wealth gets distributed amongst heirs. Before, you said you wanted so-and-so who's not even heir to get any money. No, this must come first. And like I said, taxes, okay? Yes, there's still debts. Bills, utility bills or whatever, if they haven't been paid, they need to be paid. And we also mentioned stuff that you are looking after on behalf of other people. Yes, it's not the same category as a debt, really, but you should mention it so that your heirs don't mistake it as part of your wealth. They find money, they find possessions or whatever that do not belong to the deceased. That needs to be mentioned clearly, that needs to be given back to the rightful owners. This is an amana. Okay, so that's debts. Very important to mention. Inshallah you won't have any, but if you do, then that needs to be stated clearly. Do you have any bequests? Do you want to do wasiyah? Do you want to give part of your wealth to somebody who isn't a prescribed heir? Well, this is something that you should mention. Okay, it's not a fard, but if you're intending to give part of your wealth away, then mention it. So obviously, this is after all debts and funeral expenses. That obviously has to be paid out of your estate, everything, all of that, your burial, that all has to be paid out, all your debts. After all that's been cleared, then you could start thinking about distributing wealth. So you can decide to give away, to bequeath, to make a wasiyah for up to a value of 1/3 of your total wealth. Hadith, I'm sure you know this, but Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh said, well, he actually advised people not to spend or give away more than a quarter. And the reason why he said that was because of what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ath-thuluth wa-thuluthu kathir," or he said kabir. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, yes, give up to 1/3, but 1/3 is still a lot. Thuluthu kathir. And that's why Ibn Abbas said, well, just give a quarter. Okay? But typically I think people do tend to give up to about 1/3 anyway, but don't give more than 1/3. You should not be giving more than 1/3 of your wealth away to other people who are not, because then you are depriving your prescribed heirs their rights. So who can receive a bequest? Anyone who does not receive a prescribed share according to the rules of wiratha. So you can't say, I wish my son to get this amount. and this amount exceeds what he would get under the rules of wiratha. No. Okay? Or your father or your mother. So anyone who doesn't get a prescribed share, you can say, okay, I wish them to also get something. You can make a bequest or a wasiyah to a charity, of course, and it's a good idea to perhaps do so for a sadaqah of a sadaqah jariyah type, one that will continue for a long time after your death. But like I said, must be less than the total. Everything that you bequeath must be less than 1/3. If it turns out, once the executor, we'll talk about the executor, who the executor is, but if it transpires that what you've started to distribute in this part, bequesting, comes out to more than 1/3 of your wealth, then the executor has to reduce these bequests, in as best way as possible, proportionally. So reduce them so that in total they become less than 1/3, or up to 1/3 of the total wealth of the deceased. Unless those who receive a prescribed share, all of them, agree that this is okay. So it comes up to, say, a half of your wealth. The executor then says, speaks to those who receive a prescribed share, all of them, and they all agree that that's fine, give half the wealth away and we'll have just the remaining half, then that's okay. But if one of them says no, then no. Okay? You may get some of them to agree, but those who disagree must get their full share. You cannot reduce the shares of those who receive a fixed amount. Okay, part 3. So after wasiyah, what happens to the remainder of your wealth? Well, it needs to be distributed according to the rules of wiratha. So this is after all your debts, all your funeral expenses have been paid off, and up to 1/3 of your wealth has been distributed according to your wishes. Whatever remains must be at least 2/3 of the remainder of your wealth after all the expenses have been paid. So your burial, your debts, and also all that's out the way. Whatever is left over to be distributed among the prescribed heirs must be at least 2/3 of this remainder. And it must be distributed according to the rules of Sharia, the laws of wiratha, and the ayah, famous ayah in Surah An-Nisa, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا. For men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, and for women is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave. Whether it's a little amount or a large amount, this is an obligatory share. Okay, no matter how much wealth remains, it must be distributed according to the laws of wiratha, and most of them are mentioned in Surah An-Nisa. And I'm not going to discuss this. This is not something that you need to worry about when you are writing your will. This is something that needs to be worked out after you die, and the executor has to start distributing wealth. So there's no need in your will, in your UK valid Islamic will, to mention what these shares are. Because first of all, you do not know who's going to be alive when you die. You have no idea who's going to die first or whatever, who will remain once I am dead. And let's just say you wrote your will right at the end. you're about to die, you know you're about to die, you wrote your will, even then, you know, you don't have to say how much each of my prescribed heirs is going to receive. So like I said, it's going to be determined by the executor who will distribute this according to the Islamic laws of wiratha. You may, however, want to mention that a specific heir will get a specific item from your assets. So you want perhaps a son to receive the car, or a particular car. Or you want a daughter to receive a particular piece of jewelry, or whatever. This is okay, there's no problem with this. So long as, of course, whatever you have mentioned in terms of items going to a particular person, their value do not exceed what they are entitled to according to the laws of wiratha. If it does, then you as the executor, Islamically, are obliged not to give anything more than what they are Islamically prescribed, unless you can get the heirs, all the remaining heirs, to agree. So if they say, fine, it's okay, he can have the car, or she can have this piece of jewelry, even though it does exceed what they should get, and the rest will be distributed amongst us, and we're all happy with that, that's fine. That's okay. So you must get the heirs to agree if anything goes beyond what they should be getting. What else should you mention in your DIY will? You could mention all sorts. Something important is, how you wish to be buried. You should mention that you'd like your burial to take place according, and your janazah and all that, according to Islamic law. The whole thing, the ghusl, the prayer and the burial. You may wish to mention that you do not wish a routine post-mortem or autopsy to take place. The doctors may, think it's a good idea to perform an autopsy. Well, if there's no legal requirement for that, then by all, of course, reject. And say so in your will that you do not want a routine autopsy to take place. You may have an heir who insists, I want them to cut him up or hair up because I want to figure out exactly what's going on. There may be people out there. And Islamically, we should avoid this as much as possible. Hadith narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Kasru azmil mayyiti ka kasrihi hayya." That the breaking of a dead man's bone is like breaking it while he is alive. Okay, so we need to treat bodies with respect. And this needs to be taken seriously. And cutting up a human body for no reason is something that we must avoid as possible. If possible, get them to perform a scan, an MRI, instead. Of course, sometimes it's beyond your ability, beyond our means to prevent the authorities to perform an autopsy, particularly when the death is sudden or under suspicious circumstances, and it's beyond you. You cannot do anything about it. But where you can do something about it, and if you can insist on an MRI instead, then mention it. Other things that you should mention is that you wish your body to be released immediately and buried without delay. I don't know why, but some families insist on the body remaining in refrigeration for longer. For whatever reason, they want more relatives to turn up, or people coming in from abroad or whatever. It's just not right. It's not right to delay the burial of a body. We know this. So insist upon this in your will, so that you can say, look, we can't allow this. The wishes of the deceased is that he or she gets buried immediately. Mention that you would like to be buried, close to your immediate family if you died in the UK, for example. I don't know why, but a lot of people, alhamdulillah, I think it's not happening as much as it used to happen, but how many bodies have been sent over to, whether it's Yemen or Pakistan or whatever, and it used to happen quite a lot. It happens, I think, relatively less now. But, if you insist, but really, that just causes a delay, and it can cause a delay of days, even longer. It is really, as a dead person, you believe me, you'd want to be buried quickly. Okay, and that's the sunnah. So try and insist upon that. Another important point, more so recently than it was a while back, whether or not you wish your organs to be donated. Now, the law in the UK has recently changed because it works on opt-out rather than opt-in now. In the past, it used to be that if you wanted your organs to be donated, you mentioned that you want to be an organ donor. It's the opposite now. So everyone is opted in. And if you don't want your organs donated, then you opt out. It's not that simple, though. If the family insist that they do not want the organs of the deceased to be, donated, then those wishes should be respected by the authorities. But let's just say nobody mentioned anything, and the family weren't too bothered. Well, then law says they can take your organs. Okay? So, like I said, the law recently changed a few years ago. So I would mention it if you insist on your organs not being donated, then mention it in your will. Guardianship for your children. Now, usually when you pass away, you'll have a spouse, wife, husband, to look after your children. But what happens if you're a single parent, the spouse has passed away or whatever, or both parents pass away? What's going to happen to the children? Who would you like to be looking after your children? Take guardianship of your children. You need to mention this in your will. So in the event of both you and your spouse dying while your children are under the age of 18, you don't want social services to get involved, and then either them looking after them or them choosing who they wish to be guardians of your children. So mention in your will who you would like to be the guardians of your children, particularly if you're a non-Muslim. You have non-Muslim parents, I should say. Astaghfirullah. Okay, so if you were a non-Muslim, you became a Muslim, you have non-Muslim parents, family, and so on, it's particularly important that you mention who you would like to take guardianship of your children. You do not want your children to grow up in a non-Muslim environment. So this is especially important for reverts to Islam. You might also want to mention how you would like your children's portion of the inheritance to be looked after, whether you want it to be held in a trust and invested on their behalf, how you'd like the wealth to be spent on their maintenance, on their education, and so on, until they're old enough to take responsibility for their part of the inheritance. So you may want to talk about that in your will. Who is the executor? This is really, really important that you choose the executor wisely. Who is going to implement what you state in your will? Don't just pick somebody lightly and you need to have a good chat with them and explain to them what it means to be an executor. The executor is the person or persons, you can have multiple executors, who are legally, in England, legally responsible to carry out your wishes as stated in your will. They can be a family member. There's no problem with that whatsoever, including your spouse or your wife or your husband can be the person who executes your will. Or someone entirely different, someone unrelated entirely. Could be any beneficiary, like I said, your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter, your brother, anyone, or somebody completely unrelated, or a friend, or a solicitor. It does cost quite a lot to get a solicitor to be an executor, but solicitors can act as executors, but they'll charge a lot to do that for you. So obviously, choose wisely and definitely ask their permission and explain to them what it means to be an executor of a will. What will they do? What are parts of the duties of an executor? Well, they need to know where this will is. Ideally, they'll have a copy of it, or they'll know precisely where you kept it, if you only have the one copy. I think I do mention somewhere or later on that it's probably best to have a couple of copies, one with yourself and one with the executor, so they'll know where this will is. They will have to notify, all the bodies, the banks, your employer, if you're working, all the, utility companies, if you've got insurance companies, any bills that come out via direct debit and everything. They will need to inform them all and get them to cancel any monies coming out of your accounts and so on. And of course, people like your employer, they need to know that you've passed away. You will have to get the authorities to stop payments of benefits, pensions, whatever. They'll get it back eventually, so there's no point in delaying it, because they will ask for it back. I think they might have some period of time where they'll just let you off, but you need to make sure that you do that. And one way of doing a lot of this, particularly with regards to government organizations, is to use the government's Tell Us Once service. Hopefully this link is still working. So the Tell Us Once service lets you report a death to most government organizations in one go. So you just tell them once and they will cancel quite a lot of things. Who will they contact? They'll contact the tax office, work and pensions to cancel benefits, child benefit tax credits, the passport will be cancelled, driving license, ownership of vehicles, local council will be informed, if you're getting housing benefit, council taxes and reductions and so on, your blue badge if you have one. So they'll do a lot of that, but not everything, of course. So you'll still have to contact banks, for example, and utility companies. What else will the executor do? They will have to obviously value your estate. They'll have to figure out how much wealth you had upon death, how many properties you owned, and value it. And that's not an easy task, but it's something that has to get done, which is why you need to choose your executor wisely. If inheritance tax applies, so remember the nil band rate, if you had wealth more than £325,000, excluding anything that's then given to the spouse. If inheritance inheritance tax is involved and needs to be paid to the government, the executor will have to pay that amount of money. Obviously not from their wealth, from the estate. Okay, but they are responsible for ensuring inheritance tax gets paid if that's applicable. They need to collect any all the assets, properties, anything that you might own. I mentioned the issue of grant of probate. Sometimes, in order for the executor to get control of your assets, they have to apply for what's known as a probate. They have to get a grant of probate, which is basically an official document giving you as an executor the ability to take possession of the deceased's assets. Some banks, you can tell them, I'm the executor, here's the will, I'm responsible, or I'm the next of kin, or whatever, and they will give you control of the deceased's accounts. But some banks are a bit more stringent, particularly if there's a lot of wealth involved, and they'll say we cannot release control of this account unless you can show us that you have a right of probate or you've got a grant of probate. If that's the case, and particularly when you try to take possession or control of a property, I think if you apply to get control from, to get control of the deeds, get them in your name as the executor so that you can distribute them, the land registry won't just give your property to anybody. Most likely they will say, we need grant of probate. Well, that's another thing that you need to apply through via a government agency. So if I click on this as well, there's a government website showing you how to apply for probate. It does cost, it is a fee, unfortunately, and most likely the estate will be worth more than £5,000. If it's less than that, then I don't think banks will be worried too much. You won't need grant of probate, but most of the cases it will be more than £5,000, the total value of the assets, so there is a fee for this. It's probably best, if you are going to apply for that, to get multiple copies of it. They're cheap, multiple copies, so that if you give it to somebody, land registry, then you've still got a copy to deal elsewhere. But then, once you get this probate, you then have control over the assets of the deceased. So once you've got control of everything, whether it's you were able to do it without a grant of probate or with the grant of probate, you can then start paying off debts and distributing the assets according to the Wasiyah and Wiratha. So that's the executor. Who are the witnesses? Because there need to be two witnesses according to English law. And according to Islamic law, there needs to be two witnesses for the Wasiyah part. Okay? So you need to have two witnesses. So in English law, you need to have two witnesses aged 18 or over who witness you signing your will, as we mentioned earlier. In Islamic law, it's two trustworthy Muslim men. They should witness you signing your will. If not possible, that you can get two non-Muslim. You can get two non-Muslim men, but it obviously makes sense, or it's better for you to get two Muslim men. But in Islamic law and Shar'an, they can be non-Muslims. So if you got this witnessed by solicitors, for example, and a non-Muslim, that's still okay. And in Islam, we know that two women can act as witnesses in place of one man. We know that. Okay? The issue comes when you just get two women witnesses, that's it. Legally, in England, that's okay. But for the wasiyah part of your will, you want to avoid any sort of problems between the waratha or between those who will get, part of your wasiyah. You don't want people saying, well, where are the witnesses? And then you say, here they are, they're two women. I say, Akhi, two women. It's two men or one man, two women. And you want to avoid all of that, okay? So probably best just to get two men then, I think. This is very important. Any person who benefits from your will, so anyone who gets something as part of your wasiyah or gets a prescribed share, they cannot be a witness to your will. And that kind of makes sense, okay? You know, they're getting something, they shouldn't be the witness to that, all right? You know, human nature, you know, they might twist things or... But anyway, so anyone, you know, the crux of the issue is someone who benefits from your will, they should not be one of the two witnesses. It's also best, I mentioned this, not to have a spouse of a beneficiary to be a witness. So you might have a person who is a beneficiary who will get something from your assets. It's best not to have the spouse of the beneficiary to be witnessing the will. It can be okay, but it might be problematic in a UK court of law. There might be cases where they'll say, no, there's a conflict of interest here, and so, you know, the judge will make his own mind about who gets what. You want to avoid all of that. So just be careful as to who is witnessing your will. So once you've written your will, you've got it, you've signed it, they've witnessed you signed it, they've signed it, you need to keep the will in a very safe place. You need to let the executor know where this will is, where it's hidden. Ideally, perhaps, I mean, I have read that it's best not to make multiple copies of your will. I've got 2 copies of my will. I think it's a good idea to make copies of your will. Identical copies of your will. You know, have at least a couple, one of them, and get everyone to sign all of them. So you have the multiple copies and everyone signs them all. One with yourself. You let your family know where it is. You let the executor know where it is. And the other one with the executor. Okay, in case the executor loses theirs or something happens, at least there's a copy, you know, at home somewhere safe. So I would make I would definitely make more than 1 copy. Get them all signed, identical, everything identical, dated identically and everything. One thing I mentioned, alhamdulillah, I've more or less finished the presentation. So what I'll do now is I will look at a template of a will, which I've provided a copy. This is on my OneDrive, so it's a link. Obviously, no one's going to type that, but you can scan that code and it'll take you directly to it. You can download it and fill it in. It's a Word document, so it's easily editable. So I will do that. I won't. Hopefully, if I click on this, it will open up. Yeah, so it is there. You can. I wouldn't edit it in a web browser. You know, you can just save it onto your whatever, and fill it in as appropriate. I will actually just open it up. A copy. Okay. Close that. So, like I said, this is a DIY will. This is one which should be appropriate for a lot of people, and it's, as I mentioned in the presentation, it is actually based on a will which was written many years ago, and is also available here. Unfortunately, this is a PDF and it's not easily edited. They do have boxes in there, but it's very fixed. I mean, the template will stay as it is and you can only edit parts of it, text boxes. But let's just say you wanted to edit part of it, get rid of parts on debts and things like this or whatever. It's not that straightforward. Or let's just say you wanted more space to write more things. It's not possible in a PDF very easily to do that. So, which is why this one was created. And I have modified this to make it best suited for our purposes. I don't know if you should know Sheikh Abu Isa, but he gives a useful video on, or a guide on the Islamic will, which is generally the same sort of stuff as we've been talking about. Here there's also a link to this presentation in case you wanted an electronic copy of that. I'll get to the last slide later, but I think hopefully the Word document has opened up. Yes, it has. Okay, so I'll imagine that I've printed this off. You can type in, actually you should, it's probably best to type in a lot of this stuff as it not come up. Okay. So you can just print it off and fill it in. I think it makes more sense to actually type in as much of this as you possibly can and then print it off. It has to be printed off and signed. You can't just sign an electronic copy and distribute it and so on. No, you have to, it does have to be a physical copy. So I can just type in my name. And the date, 14th, isn't it? 14th October, 2023. I'm not going to mention everything in here. It's quite a lot of it is very legal jargon, and it's just there, you know, to make it a legal document. But some of it is very Islamic in its nature. But anyway, so remember, you must revoke all previous wills. So that's the first thing, is the revocation of all previous wills. There's also then the declaration of faith that you are a Muslim. And you can put in here whatever you want. You want to write a message to your heirs, this is a good place to put it. And some people do. This is a general message, which is a very good message, in fact. You know, a reminder to those that you have left behind. And finally, to ask them, look, bury me as I have asked to be buried, and let my assets be divided as I have instructed them to be divided. I've also put in the footer here, you don't have to have anything in the footer, but you might as well put your name in there as well. But I'll leave that blank for the time being. But anyway. So number 3 is I've put in funeral wishes. There isn't a specific order for these things, but you know, this is how it's done here. So you may want to say that you'd like your ghusl, your janazah, your defn to be done according to Islamic law. You don't want an autopsy to be performed on your body and so on. You'd prefer an MRI scan if possible and so on. You'd like to be buried close to your place of death. And so you can be more specific here, as specific as you want it to be. Okay? None of that is going to make this an illegal document or anything like that. I've put in here as section 4 is the guardianship part. So I appoint my, you can say your wife, you know, that's the default, right? Really, they will be your the guardian of your, she's the parent, legally, you know, my wife, so-and-so, obviously you're not going to write so-and-so, you'd have to put a legal name, okay? Put her or his address or whatever. You want them to be the guardian of any children who are under the age of 18 at my time of death. But if he or she is unwilling, then who would you next like to be your guardian of your children? And list them. Okay? So it could be a parent, it could be a brother, it could be a sister, it could be somebody, like I said, this is very important for reverts in particular. Who is the executor? So you appoint Khalid, Ahmed, I'm just making this up, obviously, and give the address. It makes sense to have more than one executor listed. Okay, when you die, this other person might not be alive. They may be incapacitated. They might not be available. They might not want to do it anymore. Okay, you have to take these probabilities or possibilities into account.
Just a quick question.
Yes, sir.
As to how many executors you can have?
No, you can list as many executors as you want. There's no problem. Obviously, it has to be at least one. It makes sense to have more than one listed. So I think in mine I have 3. So I say I want my wife to be the executor. Your spouse is probably the best person to be the executor. Might not be, okay? But you can list your spouse, you can list your sibling, a friend, anybody, a solicitor, and you can say you want them all to be executors and not give any order of preference, in which case they can work together as executors. Or you can say, I want the executor to be from this list in order of preference. This is the preference order. So if the first person accepts, then they are the executor, or the second person, or third person, and so on. Or like I said, you can have them all to be the executors, and they share the responsibility. Yes, Akhi?
I think there's a danger, speaking from a legal point of view, there's a danger if you have a large number of executors that there can be a dispute between executors on the translation and interpretation of the will, and that then can escalate. So it is probably better to have one executor, but if that person is unable to carry out the requirement, name a second executor. That's according to the English law, and it would be tested under English law. And the second point is, you're right when you say that you should have a footer, you should have that signed on each page by the person that's making the will. That's important as well, in case it could be suggested someone's added something to the will subsequently, and so that needs to be also signed.
Yes, Jazakallah. The brother made 2 points, in case you never heard. Firstly, that it's probably best not to have a group of executors all executing the will, and that makes sense. Best to have an order of preference of executors, so that if the first one accepts, they will be the executor, or the executor, as he said. Okay, okay. I call it. So long as it's not executioner, all right? You don't want it. That's the worst thing. Yeah. If you have a group of executors or executors, then, like he said, they might disagree as to what your intentions were, or they might misconstrue certain things and disagree. Like I said, you need to have a deep conversation with anybody you list down here. Don't take it lightly. They need to know exactly what the situation is. And if you're going to have a group of them working together, you need to sit them down and talk through your will. Make sure things are clear. But it is probably best to have just the one single person. Okay? But have a list of them, so that if the first person accepts, and they are the executor. okay, and so on. So here you could say, so I've said so-and-so and Usama, Khalid. I don't know why Khalid, but just anyway. Of a particular address, to be executors and trustees of this will. Or you could say, or to be executors in order of preference as listed above. Also, make it clear that you want them to be chosen, from the top down kind of thing. Okay? In order of preference as given. Okay. And the other point the brother mentioned as well, before I forget, is that here in this footer, it is a good idea to write the name. And also, just in case, to get the will writer, me in this case, to sign each page as well. You don't want to give anybody any excuse to say, oh, someone's played around with this will. Okay, or added a page, or removed a page and added there, or whatever. Okay. Right. So this is some legal jargon here. Say that you want all the residue of your estate and any property that you have left after or at your death to be given over to your trustees, untrust to sell, call in, convert, any. So this is basically giving your trustees, the executors, essentially, all the power to, gather your assets, to sell off things, your properties, for example, so that it can be distributed appropriately. So giving them all power to deal with your assets, essentially, as they see fit. I've also mentioned here in a box, clause 6.2, which is hinted at here. See clause 6.2 for debts. That your debts are paid out first. Okay, your funeral expenses and your debts are paid out first, as it says here, out of which shall be paid my funeral expenses and my debts, and you can list your debts here. And if you have no debts, well, you can get rid of this box entirely. Okay, so I request my trustees to pay off the following debts from my estate, and be clear with that. And then really the part which talks about Wasiyah and Wiratha appears here in section 7, which mentions the Wasiyah or the bequests in box 7.2. You may not have any bequests at all. Okay, you might not have any Wasiyah. You don't want to give anything up to a third of your wealth. Well, in that case, you can get rid of that or say none or whatever. Blank it out entirely. Otherwise, you don't want people to be filling this in afterwards. Okay, so just get rid of it. And you want to say, I wish to bequeath £1,000 to my uncle, Mr. Ahmed Abdullah. Okay, and you can be more specific, you put an address and so on and so forth, but it should be clear who that person is to the executor or the executor. And so on. You may wish to donate a proportion of your wealth to a charity. You can name the charity, give the registered charity number and so on, give the amount or whatever, or you could just say to your executor that you want them to build a well up to the value of this on your behalf, and they should do that, and you don't have to mention a specific charity. This is just legal jargon that you'd find in most wills out there in England, although some of it does emphasize that Islamic principles of investment should be applied, and that your trustees should not be liable for any loss, because part of it may be that your trustees will end up investing part of your wealth. Maybe your children are not old enough to handle their own wealth. Or do you just leave that wealth hanging around, or do you invest it wisely? And investments can be a bit risky. So that's just something in there to mention, that your trustees shall not be held liable for any loss as a result of that. And here we are, finally signing the will, so dated. And signed. This is obviously after it's printed off. I'm not signing it electronically. And written your name, typed preferably, but it doesn't really matter. And your two witnesses are witnessing you sign it, and then they sign here. Their name, their address. They don't have to put their occupation, but it's there anyway. So both of them must be signing this after they have witnessed you signing yours. Something else that I've added that you'll find in some templates is a list of your assets, your major assets. I mean, you might have things at home which are hardly worth including here, like some clothes and stuff like this, but talking about major assets. It's not necessary that you put this as part of your will, because your executor, your executor will be, it's part of their responsibility to collate and find out what your assets are. Hopefully they already have a good idea of your assets anyway, but to help them make a list of your assets and include it at the back of your will. And this is somewhere where you could do that. You put your name and address there, and you can then list your assets. So list any properties that you own, all your bank accounts, any pensions that you hold, shares in companies, jewelry, expensive pieces of equipment, any major assets. It's a good idea to mention them here, just to make the life of the executor easier, and they've got all those details at hand, and then they can contact the appropriate authorities, organizations to get control of those assets. Okay, so that's the template. And like I said, one of the duties of the executor is to work out the prescribed shares of the heirs that must receive a share of your wealth. Of course, it might be this situation that once all the debts have been paid off, and the burial expenses, that there might be nothing left, and that's just the way it is. But if there is wealth that remains, then it needs to be distributed. Your wasiyah sorted out, and whatever's left, 2/3 needs to be distributed according to the laws of wiratha, and the executor has the responsibility now of working out what these shares are. Not an easy task in many cases. In some cases, it is pretty straightforward. For example, let's just say me. Let's pick a pen. So let's just say I passed away and I've left behind let's keep it simple. I've left behind a wife, I've left behind a son and a daughter. How do you spell daughter? Okay. But you've left behind others as well. You've left behind a brother, a sister, grandparent. I'm leaving out parents deliberately to keep it simple, okay? Who gets a prescribed share Islamically in this situation? Anyone know?
The wife. The son.
The wife, definitely. The son, definitely.
Daughter.
The daughter. Brother?
No.
Sister? Grandparents?
Depends if there was a...
Unless not prescription.
It's still prescribed.
I think there's no fault.
No.
All right. Okay. Let's just say the father and the mother. Okay? But there's grandparents.
No.
Grandparents, definitely not. Okay, there are rules which kick out distant relatives, more distant than those. So in this situation, the grandparents won't inherit anything because there are parents. And the brothers and sisters won't inherit anything because there's children involved here. Well, let's just keep things very simple, because we're not here to discuss the rules of wiratha. But let's just keep things simple here in this situation, where we know that those people won't inherit. There's no parents involved here in this case. All of these will inherit. What would they get? Does anyone know what they would get? What would the wife get in this case? She'll get an eighth, mashallah. Why an eighth? Because if there weren't any children, she'll get a quarter, okay? And in this case, what does the son get and the daughter get? Don't they get a fixed share, these people? Doesn't a son get a fixed share, like a half or a... No, the daughter? Does the son can the son get a fixed share at any time? No. What about the daughter?
If there's no son.
Yeah. A daughter can get a fixed share if there isn't a son involved. She doesn't have a brother. So even in a situation like this, things can get a bit complicated in certain situations if you don't know some of the basic rules. But in this case, the only fixed prescribed share is the wife, and she will get an eighth because there are kids involved. Okay, there are children. And whatever's left over gets distributed amongst these children according to لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that a son or a male child gets twice what the daughter will get. So what's left over? 7/8. 7/8. So out of this 7/8, the son has to get twice what the daughter gets. So how many shares are distributed really?
3 shares.
There are 3 shares. Because there's 2 kids and a son gets twice the share of a daughter, well, there's 3 shares in total. 1 share for the daughter and 2 shares for the son. So there's actually 3 shares. So this amount needs to be divided into 3. Okay? 7/8 divided by 3 is what? 7/24. 7/24. So each of these 7/24.
In your opinion,
Yes.
your experience, would you recommend these online calculators?
Yeah, I was going to get to that.
Oh, sorry.
Barakallah feek, jazakallah khair. Don't worry if you the last time you did fractions was in school, all right? And even then you didn't understand them, kind of thing. Yeah.
Sometimes it's better to express 7/24 or whatever into a percentage.
Yes.
And then work the percentage on the amount.
Yes.
And that's a lot easier.
Yes.
I have found,
Yes.
for executives to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I mean,
This is going to be quite complicated, particularly where you've got a number of children and other parties that would be entitled to the share.
Yes.
So it's probably easy to do it as a percentage.
Yeah.
Certainly I've seen it.
Yeah.
You know the 1/3 that you spoke about the Wasiyah? Brothers can please remember the IQ center. We have other charities.
So the brother responsible for this center is saying, remember the IQ center in your wasiyah. And it is a good cause, definitely, mashallah. So, yes, you can easily convert these into percentages, but remember what we're saying here is that, just to remind ourselves, we're going to get rid of them. I'm going to forget all the maths in a bit, but just so that, this can get complicated. And back in the day, at the time of the Sahaba, algebra didn't really exist, but you still had very intelligent Sahaba who were able to sort this out. Primarily, for example, who was perhaps the one, who could easily sort out people's issues in Wiratha? Mu'adh ibn Jabal is faqih. Ali ibn Abi Talib was known to have a good grasp of numbers. But today it's a lot easier, of course. But just to remind ourselves where we are with this. So I've said that there's me. I've left behind a wife. She's going to get an 1/8. I've got a son and a daughter. The son must get twice the daughter. So whatever's left over, what was left over was 7/8 from all my assets. This is to be distributed into 3 bits, 3 shares. So I've divided this by 3. Each of these will therefore be 7/24. Each portion is 7/24 of my entire wealth. So the daughter will get 7/24 of my wealth. The son will get 14/24 of my wealth, 2 lots of this. But the brother's saying just convert these into percentages, which is, easily enough. An 1/8 is 12.5%. Stick that into your calculator. 7/8. Article.
87.5.
87.5.
7 divided by 24 is what?
I'm with 7/8.
No, forget the 7/8. I'm talking about the daughter's share. So what's 7/24? 7 divided by 24.
29.1%.
29.1%. Okay. All right, so that's the daughter's share of my wealth, and the son will get twice that, so nearly 60%.
58.2.
Yeah, 58.2. So 58.2, and the daughter getting 29.1%. Hopefully, this will all add up to 100%. Okay, now the point is here, even in a simple situation like this, it might be beyond, some people's mathematical ability to sort this out, which is why you should speak to those who are knowledgeable in this field, or in situations like this, it's why not use an online Islamic calculator? And I have put links to them in the slides. So right at the end, by the way, I'll also put a video recording to this talk here eventually, once this is made available electronically there. But this is perhaps the most commonly used, I think. I found this to be perhaps the most trustworthy one of the ones that I have played around with. Very simple to use. This is another one. It's far more complicated. Even allows you to pick a particular school of fiqh or madhab, because most of them agree with the majority of the rules of wiratha, but there are cases where there is differences of opinion amongst the madhahib, so you can select a particular madhab there. And this is actually downloadable, so you can use it without internet. But I found this one, because I did play around with a particular case, and I found that this one didn't give us, it wasn't correct. I don't think it was. It definitely differed from this one. But and I found this, in terms of listing the rules involved, very transparent. So let's just have a quick look at it.
Can you just read out that website?
So this is inheritance.ilmsummit.org. inheritance.ilmsummit.org. Again, there's the QR code for it. There's the link. But I did find this one to be, although when I spoke to I Will solicitors, I did speak to them a while back and I showed them my presentation. You have to check with the experts, and they suggested the last one. I think he did say that they use them. But like I said, I've played around with both of them, and I'm a lot happier with this one here. Maybe they didn't see that first one, I'm not really too sure. But here's this Islamic inheritance calculator, and it's very straightforward to use. Anyone can use this very straightforwardly. So let's just have a look at the case that we've just mentioned. So I said I have a wife, didn't I? Just the one. If you had more than one wife, you'd put in 2, 3, up to 4, of course. What happens to that if I have children? What happens to that 8th amongst the wives?
It's shared equally between them.
Gets shared. So if it was just the one wife, she'd get a lot more than if there were multiple wives. So, yeah. But anyway, I had one son and one daughter. And like I said, if I mentioned I also have grandsons. I have a grandfather. No, I won't mention grandfather because then I'll have to say that. Let's leave that out. I have brothers, I said. No, take that out. I have a brother, I have a sister, I think I mentioned. Yes?
What if you have an adopted daughter and you want them to get a share from the Wasiyah, because obviously they don't inherit, but you want them to get not a single penny more or less than your other daughter? So how would that go on?
Yeah, so, okay, good question. First of all, an adopted daughter. So it's like we don't have adoption in Islam, first of all. We don't adopt, we can foster children, but legally they might be your adopted daughter, and they don't get a fixed share, obviously. They don't have wiratha. Wiratha is not involved, but you can, of course, bequeath, wasiyah, and you mentioned. So if you wanted them to get something, then you'd mention that in the wasiyah part. But you also said that you want to make sure that the executor does not give them more than your actual daughter. Is that what you said? You want them to get exactly the same. You can mention that. That's no issue. So long as it's not more than a third of your entire estate. And you'd have to mention that. You'd have to mention that in your wasiyah as clearly as you possibly can. And the executor is legally bound to follow your instructions.
It does mention adopted daughter up there next to daughters, but top it mentions it, next to the daughter.
Oh, sorry, next to daughters.
It's knowledgeable.
So, like I said, adopted daughter, stepdaughter, illegitimate daughter are not eligible. So they don't. You can't put them in there. You can't, because they don't get a share. But like I said, if you wanted them to get something like that, you'd mention that in the Wasiyah part. Doesn't appear here at all. So what we mentioned. Okay, so let's calculate. And by the way, there are some notes. I like this website. Non-Muslim relatives are not eligible for inheritance. Okay. I didn't mention this, by the way. I should have mentioned that you do not inherit from a non-Muslim, and a non-Muslim does not inherit from you. The famous, or the part of the poetry laws written